All right, welcome to Live, Lead, and In Between, a podcast for leaders who want to be better at leading life and everywhere in between. My name is Travis Jones, and I'm the host for this podcast. And I am here. It's a little early, drinking my coffee. I know backwards the way they got my camera set up, you can't read the coffee mug, but it just says, "Be careful, or you will end up in my sermon." My brother actually got this cup for me for Christmas. I think it was last year, and incidentally, the last couple times, or last time that I preached, he actually wound up in my sermon. So kudos. All right. He was being prophetic about that. But anyway, so today's podcast, I think this is the second one of April. And today's podcast has me kind of thinking about specifically our limitations and capabilities. One of the things that I have noticed, I think I've mentioned this, that I'm trying to get into this kind of physical shape. Now, I am 44 years old, and I've always had this goal to kind of be in kind of a peak physical condition, right? Everybody, harkens back to their memories of high school and things like that when you feel like you're in your peak physical condition. But at 44, I'm thinking, I want to be in this. I want to be in really good physical condition for my health and things like that. So I've kind of been on a fitness journey, just a little bit, and I have been. Thought I wanted to do the Murph, and I kind of explained that in one of the other podcast that I talked about, so you can go back and check that out. But something interesting has been happening with me as I've been trying to do this. I mentioned in the previous podcast that life had been organizing me, and one of the things, in order to kind of get in a place where you're being more healthy about things and you're getting into better physical shape, is you have to be consistent. Consistency rules the day. You can't go one day, take 3 weeks off, and then go again, because that's not consistent. You have to be consistent in how you're doing it. And so a couple of things have been happening. Number one, again, my schedule has been organizing me, which has made it difficult for me to stay consistent with work, family life, things like that. And the second is, when I have been able to go for long distance runs, which is my avenue of getting things started, I've noticed something happening to me that probably I've not really particularly noticed before as I'm pressing through to a goal. It's nothing for me to run 5 or 6 miles in a setting, but here lately, when I've tried to do that, I get to a place where mentally I'm ready to go, but physically my body starts to say, "No, we're not going to do this." And it's different. And I know some of you out there thinking, "Oh, you're just getting older." Well, yes, but at the same time, I don't think the switch works like that. At least I've not experienced it working like that, but I feel like it's like I'm coming up against a pressure point or an opposition to that next level, right? I mean, it's one thing to run 5 or 6 miles, but it's another thing to run 5 or 6 miles and then do like 100 push-ups and 100 front squats and things like that afterwards or during the process. So as I'm approaching that, it's becoming harder and harder, and my body's trying to shut me down. Even so much so that as I'm doing this, I'm afterwards, even when I'm not able to do the 5 or 6 miles, I've found myself getting little colds and things like that. And I know that I have a kid in school and 2 toddlers. And so, exposed to all kind of stuff. So that's probably what that is. But it's been very interesting. And it brought this kind of truth to my mind that the more you press in to a thing that you are really about and really want to see happen, or a thing that God is calling you to do, the more you press into that, the more opposition you will face. And that's just the truth. I've experienced that, and I've got some stories that I'm going to share with that. But sometimes, let me go back and repeat that. The more you press in, the more opposition you will face. Now, sometimes the opposition is in you, either in your heart, in your head, and other times it's external to you. It could be other people. It could be spiritual opposition that you are facing. It could be a combination of those two things that you wind up facing. So the more you press into a particular area you're supposed to be pressing into, the more opposition you face. So this, outside of the running story I just told, one of the things that has really caught my attention is we're moving to do something a little different at the church that I serve at. And it was interesting that as I got closer, there was a meeting scheduled with an individual that was, could be an integral part of this new thing that we're looking at doing. And when I say new thing, it's like a new ministry or anything like that. Just entertaining some thoughts and things like that. But as this scheduled meeting grew closer, one of the things that began to happen to my schedule at the at the church I serve is there was so much little interpersonal conflicts that kept popping up. And it was a lot of opposition, and it seemingly had nothing to do with that, but it became so prevalent that I started tracking how often that these things were popping up. And it just so happened that the closer I got to the date of meeting with this person, the more those things reared up. And it was interesting. And I thought, wow, there is both people and spiritual opposition happening at the same time. Though the people didn't know about any particular meeting, there was something spiritual that was trying to oppose what was going on and keep my mind off of that kind of stuff. It caused division and things like that, because that's what spiritual opposition seeks to do: division and anger and all those things like that. So it can happen, and there's a reason that it happens. There's a reason that opposition occurs. So let's walk through the three things that I just mentioned: both spiritual, people, and then what's in you. So let's talk about the reason that opposition typically occurs with other people. Typically, when you have opposition coming against you, when you're headed a particular direction, typically with people, that's about selfishness or misunderstanding. I mean, typically, there's not been, well, I take that back. I was going to say I haven't experienced the other route where it's been one of those things where someone has purposefully done that, but I actually have had a person purposely work against me, and they even tell me to my face that they were going to work against me in a moment of like anger. And they did actively do that. So that's one of the reasons, or why opposition occurs, is you either have people working actively against you, which is pretty rare, or there's some selfishness to it, the motivation behind working against you because they feel like threatened by what you're doing, or it's just simply a misunderstanding. And those two things are typically the things that I've noticed being the things that cause the opposition with other people. But and what do you do? What do you do when you have opposition from others towards something that's going on? If it's active opposition where I'm going to work against you, then the best thing you can do is pray for that person and ignore it. Because if they're willfully trying to disrupt the things you're doing, you're not going to be able to stop that. They've already taken themselves out of any authority you may have, so you're not going to be able to stop that. Just ignore it, work ahead, and know that if someone that willingly tries to do that, they're not going to succeed. And in the end, the truth will come out with that kind of stuff. And actually, that's what happened in that situation with me. And it got pretty hairy for a little bit, but I just kept working, pressing forward. If a person's selfish, there's some selfishness or misunderstanding. Typically selfish, if there's selfish motives behind something like that, people don't even know. They don't even know that they're being selfish about it, or that they have a selfish motivation until they know. And if there's a misunderstanding, the way you solve both of those issues is to come together in a meeting. Come together, spend some time, grab a coffee, whatever you need to do, and just talk through it. But talk through it with the prerequisite of assuming the best about the person as you're working through it. And typically that opposition resolves itself once either the selfish motivation is revealed or the misunderstanding is taken care of. So that's one reason, and how to handle opposition when it occurs with people. Now, what do you do if you have spiritual opposition occur to you or against you? The reason, before we get into what you do, the reason you have spiritual opposition against you is simply because you're a threat to the dark side of things. The spirit of opposition is in opposition to the things of God, and if it's if you're after the things of God and you're working in a direction that God has called you to, or you feel like God has called you to, if you've discerned that correctly, then you will face spiritual opposition, and it will manifest itself in all kinds of ways. And I was going to say weird ways, but some of them aren't weird. Some of them are people oriented. Like I said, that combo of things where people will unwillingly do the work of the spiritual opposition that's there, because there's offense and things like that. Or there'll be weird stuff that happens, right? And all that stuff, all that opposition is designed to do from the enemy's perspective is to make you think he's bigger than he is, and to distract you from what you're doing. Because technically he really doesn't have the the power to do anything other than to deceive and things like that. So spiritual opposition tends to look like that. And I've got stories of both opposition for people, combo opposition from spiritual opposition with people playing a role in that, and then just direct weird spiritual stuff that has happened. And it's been super odd to actually see that kind of stuff actually happen. So let me give an example of a time where there was a combo thing that happened. It was earlier on in ministry, and I was I was in children's ministry, and or I was overseeing children's ministry, and I think it was a Wednesday night or some night like that, one of the standard church nights, and we were headed in a particular direction as a children's ministry, but we'd had some turnover and some change in some of the leadership structure of our children's ministry. And one evening after most of the kids have gone, I had a lady come walking down the stairs that I've only talked to maybe 2 or 3 times in my life. And this lady walked up to me and started acting a little odd, like a little more than a little odd. So much so was she acting different. And remember, I've only spoken to her 2 or 3 times, that I picked up on it immediately. And it was just very odd behavior, and odd for her, even in the small interactions that I'd had. And in those small interactions, I sat there and I said, "Can you hold on for a second? I've got one of my children's staff. We're gonna, once we get the rest of the kids out here, we'd like to pray for you." And of course, the person hung around and we prayed for that person. And at the end of it, that person's like, I don't even remember walking down here. Like, that was the kind of thing that happened. It was both a combo of spiritual and people, and it was weird, right? So we prayed for, whatever it was to remove itself, from her. And I literally remember thinking, I am very familiar, like this thing was trying to, and I say this thing because it wasn't her, this thing was trying to walk up on me, and I was like, no, I picked that up real quick. But we were headed in a direction as a ministry, and that opposition began to present itself in weird ways. Other weird oppositional stuff that has happened from a spiritual standpoint, like, my wife and I have been, as we have stepped into different seasons of ministry, we've had different odd, weird things happen spiritually. And some of them have, honestly, you talk about spooky natural stuff, but none of that stuff's spooky anyway. But like, there was one evening where our back door camera went off on our back deck, and like, lo and behold, there was a figure standing at our back door, and it stood there for 4 minutes. And the camera just it kicked on because it picked up this image, and it just stood there. And it couldn't get in, right? Because it didn't have legal authority to come in, but it just stood there. And those things, they're on a short leash anyway. They're only allowed to do what Christ allows them to do, but it just stood there. And I thought, wow, okay, God allowed us to see this thing, to know that there was opposition that was present there. So we prayed over our house, and because this is our house, and we anointed the doorpost and said, no, this is a barrier to anything dark that would try to enter and try to cause conflict and things like that, or opposition. And so, people stuff and weird stuff can happen, opposition. But what do you do with that? Exactly what I said. You handle it that way. If you're unsure if it's spiritual opposition and you're a believer, then you can simply ask God, Lord, is this opposition? Is this coming against me? What is this? And I mean, He's always talking. It's just most of the time we're not listening. So ask God, and then ask Him how to handle it, because chances are you have authority over what it is that's coming against you. Now, there's a whole other thing that we could get into, and where we would talk about, okay, you have authority over it, but you've invited it in, and that's kind of another podcast. And just know that you can do that, right? You can have authority over this space, your house and whatnot, and then through your actions or through your inaction with things that are sinful, you can actually invite and be in agreement with certain spiritual aspects of opposition, and they'll come right in if they're invited. So, at any rate, so there's the people opposition, there's spiritual opposition. But what do you do when the opposition is in you? What do you do? And why is there opposition in you? So when you have opposition in you, whether it's your heart or your mind or your thoughts, because those two things are connected, it means that you are coming up against what you believe to be true about yourself. When you have internal opposition that you're facing, or a limitation that you've come up against, kind of what I'm talking about with my running example at the very beginning of this, you are coming up against what you believe to be true about yourself. Now, as I even say that now, I'm thinking, okay, what do I believe to be true about me with regard to this fitness goal that I have? Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is I'm not going to be able to achieve it, right? That's the first thing that pops in my head is I'm not going to be able to achieve it. And I'm 44, and I if I was going to achieve it by now, I would have already achieved it. So the first thing I'm thinking of is I believe this thing to be true about me. And so I'm coming up to a glass ceiling, which is basically a limitation imposed by myself, which is not true. I am fully capable. I am fully capable of hitting that goal. So when you face these limitations and things like that, and they're internally in you, it has to do with you coming up against something that you believe true about you. And a lot of times that's a hard subject to wrap your brain around and your heart. Because some of those things you believe to be true about yourself are planted deep, 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 deep inside your heart. And you don't even know that they're there until you start experiencing opposition. You're like, why am I experiencing opposition to this? And why is it internal to me? Well, that's because there's something you believe to be true internally. So how do you handle that? How do you address that? Well, that's one of those things. Again, I'm gonna slip over from a standpoint of being a believer that I have a little bit of a cheat. I can say to the Holy Spirit, what is it that it's in me that I'm believing to be true that's preventing me from doing this? What lie have I believed? And I would just allow him to speak. And just in that moment when it just popped in my head, I didn't come up with that. It just popped in there. That was the Holy Spirit saying, hey, this is what you believe. It's not true, but you believe it enough to where you're imposing this upon yourself. So now that I know that this is the reason internally why I feel this way and what I believe, and I'm challenging that, then when I'm going running today, when that thing pops up, and it will now, it'll pop up that you won't be able to do this, I can resist it. I can say that's a lie. I am completely able to do this, and I'm going to. Watch me. And I'm going to do it. And so I'm going to break through that limitation. And when you break through that limitation, that glass ceiling, that thing you believe to be true, that opposition to what you're trying to do, don't think that that's the end, because you'll start soaring after that, and then you'll hit another layer of opposition. And typically, again, if it's internal to you, that opposition, that means there's another lie that needs to be broken off of you. And like I said, that's how you handle it. So again, just some thoughts and musings today about, I think I called this podcast Pressure Point, because we all experience pressure at some point, and it usually is when we're trying to move in a direction that we're supposed to be moving. And so, there's probably a lot more that I could say about this. There's probably a lot more that you could say about this, but I think we're gonna call it right there with this particular podcast. And I'll get back to you the next time I'm on here and let you know how it worked out with the opposition and pressure that I was facing after I go for my run today. So before I do the whole "this has been Live, Lead, and In Between," I would love to encourage you, if you haven't checked out our Patreon page, you can do so. We set this up, or I say we, like I have this huge conglomeration of company working behind me. It's me. But I set this up to try to engage people in a different way and actually allow for people to support the podcast. So if you're interested in doing that, you like what you hear, you want to support, I think the minimum is like $5, and that just helps support the podcast and helps potentially get new equipment, things like that, new cameras, which probably going to need some pretty soon. But it helps doing that kind of stuff. So I would love if you would do that. If not, no big deal. The podcast will always be free. I have thought about offering some paid content through Patreon. Haven't quite got there yet, but I'm thinking through that. Also want to make you aware that, if you're watching this on YouTube or the video version, specifically YouTube, hit the like button, subscribe, so you get updates when they pop through. I always share this on my social media page too. But hit those subscribe, like button, things like that, and it pushes it further up in the algorithm so other people can see it. And then share it. Share the video content. And if you aren't a video content person and you're listening to this through a podcast app like Spotify, which I think Spotify does the video as well, or Apple Podcasts, things like that, wherever you get your podcast content, subscribe and like there too. And share it. Share it if you think this is helpful for people. And also, I'd love to say, if you have a comment, a question, comment, and I like to say it this way: if you have questions, comments, or protests, shoot me a line. I include my Live, Lead, and In Between email in all the show notes, so you can email me directly. And I'd love to get your thoughts and potential show topics. If there's things you would like to engage with and talk about, shoot me an email. They're in the show notes. I'd love to be able to do that. So with all that said, this has been live, lead, and in between. And I want to encourage you to lead well in every area of your life. And when you face opposition, and you will, no matter what type it is, lean in that much harder and press through. So with that said, again, this has been Live, Lead, and In Between. Lead well.